All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on a topic that's been in the news a lot recently,
Yeah.
and that's fentanyl.
Yeah, fentanyl.
I mean, it seems like it's everywhere right now, and over the last, I'd say 3 years especially,
It's everywhere.
it's just exploded.
Yeah, it's been a huge issue,
It's a crisis.
especially in North and South America.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's become quite a problem.
And we wanted to really dig in and figure out, like, what is it about fentanyl
Yeah.
that makes it so dangerous?
Why is it so dangerous?
What does it actually do to your brain
Yeah.
and body?
What's it do to your body?
Right.
Right.
I mean, most people know that it's an opioid, and it was
Yeah.
originally developed to help with pain relief.
Yeah, it's incredibly effective for pain relief
Yeah.
because it's a very powerful opioid.
Yeah.
It acts on certain pathways in your brain and spinal cord
Yeah.
that basically block pain signals.
To kind of help us understand all of this,
Yeah.
we've got a ton of sources we've been looking at today.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Articles, research papers, expert testimony,
Yeah.
just kind of looking at the science, the risks,
Mm-hmm.
and the bigger picture of the fentanyl crisis. And really what we want to do is try to extract like the most crucial information so we can all kind of wrap our heads around it,
Distill it down
distill it down right,
to the most important parts.
without being overwhelmed by it.
Right.
So with that being said, let's jump right in. So how does fentanyl actually work?
Okay. So fentanyl is an opioid.
Yeah.
So like other opioids, it basically interferes with pain signals
Okay.
traveling from your brain to your spinal cord. And it does that by attaching itself to opioid receptors,
Okay.
which are on nerve cells.
So these opioid receptors, we hear about opiates and opioids.
Yeah.
Are those the same thing?
So opiates are a type of opioid.
Okay.
Opiates are naturally occurring. They're derived from the opium poppy plant.
Okay.
So morphine and codeine
Got it.
are two examples of that.
So those are opiates.
Those are opiates. And then opioids are like the umbrella term.
The opioid is the umbrella term.
Okay.
That includes the natural opiates,
Yeah.
but then also semi-synthetic opioids like heroin
Okay.
and then the fully synthetic ones. And that's where fentanyl falls.
Okay, got it.
It's completely synthetic.
So it's man-made.
It's man-made, yeah.
So our bodies already have these opioid receptors.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're kind of designed to respond to these drugs in a way.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's like we're set up for it.
Why is that?
Well, the reason we have those receptors is because our bodies actually make their own opioids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
They're called
They're called endogenous opioids.
endogenous opioids.
You've probably heard of endorphin.
Endorphins. Yeah.
And the word endorphin actually comes from the term endogenous morphine.
Oh, okay.
But there are a bunch of other types,
Mm.
like enkephalins and dynorphins and endomorphins
Yeah.
and nociceptin.
I feel like I'm back in chemistry class.
Right. Okay.
So what happens when fentanyl enters the picture?
So fentanyl basically hijacks the system.
Okay.
It binds to those same receptors
Yeah.
that our natural opioids bind to, but it does it much more strongly,
Okay.
and it triggers a much more intense response.
Yeah.
It's almost like if you think about like a key.
Okay.
It's like a super strong key. That not only opens the lock, but it like breaks all the mechanisms inside as well.
Got it.
So it overpowers the whole system.
So can you kind of walk us through how pain signals would normally travel through the body?
Yeah.
And then how fentanyl kind of interferes with that whole process?
Yeah, so let's imagine you hit your thumb with a hammer,
Oh, okay.
right?
I'm already feeling it.
So you hit your thumb with a hammer and that activates a sensory nerve. That sends a signal up your arm
Okay.
to your spinal cord.
Okay.
And in your spinal cord, that first nerve, it's called a presynaptic neuron,
Presynaptic. Okay.
communicates with a second nerve. And that second nerve is called a postsynaptic neuron.
Postsynaptic neuron. Got it.
And that point of communication between those two neurons is called a synapse.
A synapse. Okay.
And then that second nerve, that postsynaptic neuron,
Yeah.
carries the signal up your spinal cord through your brainstem to a part of your brain called the thalamus.
The thalamus. So,
You can think of the thalamus as your brain's like central switchboard,
okay.
directing those pain signals to the right processing areas.
Okay.
So in this case, it sends the signal to your primary somatosensory cortex,
Somatosensory cortex.
which is where you consciously become aware of the pain.
Okay.
And at the same time, it also sends the signal to the amygdala,
Amygdala. Okay.
which handles the emotional aspects of pain. Like why you feel so bad about hitting your thumb with a hammer.
Okay. So that's like the ascending
So that's the ascending pathway. Yeah.
pathway of the signal.
Yeah, the signal going up.
Going up. What about the descending pathway?
Okay, so there's also a descending pathway.
Okay.
After you get an injury, you don't need to feel that intense pain forever.
No, thankfully.
So your brain sends signals back down to regulate the pain.
Okay.
So the thalamus
Yeah.
sends a signal to an area of your brain called the midbrain,
Midbrain. Okay.
specifically a place in your midbrain called the periaqueductal gray.
Periaqueductal gray.
Okay, and from there, the signals travel down through your brainstem and spinal cord to an area in the spinal cord called the substantia gelatinosa.
The substantia gelatinosa. So it
Yeah.
sounds like this substantia gelatinosa
Right.
is where that initial pain signal was being relayed.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and that's where our natural opioids are released
Okay.
to dampen that pain signal.
So they basically block it.
Not block it, but modulate it.
Modulate it. Okay.
Reduce the intensity.
Got it. And so how do opioids like fentanyl disrupt this communication?
So the communication at the synapse between those two neurons
Yeah.
is done with chemical messengers. They're called neurotransmitters.
Neurotransmitters.
And the two key neurotransmitters involved with pain signaling are glutamate
Glutamate,
and GABA.
GABA. Okay.
Glutamate generally excites the signal and keeps it going, and GABA generally inhibits the signal and helps it stop.
Okay, so glutamate is like the on switch.
The on switch.
And GABA is like the off switch.
Exactly, the off switch.
So I think you mentioned earlier we've got these different types of opioid receptors.
Yeah, we have a bunch, but the main three that we focus on are mu
Delta
and kappa.
Okay.
And fentanyl can bind to all three. But it has a real preference for the mu receptor.
The mu receptor. Okay.
Yeah.
So where are those located?
So they're located throughout the body,
Yeah.
but they're not all in the same concentration.
Okay.
So for example, in your digestive system, there's a high concentration of mu receptors. And that contributes to the really severe constipation that a lot of people with opioid use experience in the nervous system.
Yeah.
We have the mu receptors, the substantia gelatinosa,
Right.
that are really important for pain modulation.
Which we talked about, right?
Yeah.
The ascending and descending pathways.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But then you also have mu receptors
Yeah.
in your brainstem.
And those are the ones that are
And those are the ones that,
super dangerous.
yeah, they're really dangerous.
Because they control breathing.
Well, they control your brain's ability to sense carbon dioxide levels.
Ooh. Yeah.
And that's what can cause slowed breathing or stop breathing.
Which is how people die.
Yeah, that's the main cause of death from overdose.
Wow.
You also have mu receptors in the thalamus
Okay.
and the cerebral cortex.
Yeah.
Which are involved in processing pain.
Got it.
And then you have the mesolimbic pathway.
The mesolimbic pathway.
Yeah, that's an important one.
Okay, so what is the mesolimbic pathway and why is it so important?
So the mesolimbic pathway is a key part
Okay.
of the brain's reward system.
Okay.
And it involves an area in the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA.
VTA, okay.
The VTA communicates with an area deep in the brain called the nucleus accumbens.
Nucleus accumbens.
Yeah. So normally the VTA releases GABA.
And GABA, right, the off switch.
Yeah. The off switch, yeah,
Okay.
releases GABA into the nucleus accumbens.
Okay.
And that GABA acts like a brake to inhibit the release of dopamine.
So dopamine is kind of the...
Dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter.
Okay.
So when you experience something pleasurable, like eating a really delicious meal,
Okay.
the VPA reduces its GABA release.
Okay.
So it lifts the brake.
Okay.
And that allows the nucleus accumbens to release dopamine. And that gives you those feelings of pleasure and reward.
So fentanyl basically just floods the system with dopamine.
That's exactly what it does.
Okay.
It binds to the mu receptors in the VTA, and it inhibits the release of GABA.
So it takes the brakes off.
It takes the brakes off.
Wow. Okay.
And it leads to a huge surge of dopamine being released into the nucleus accumbens. And that flood of dopamine causes that intense euphoria that people experience when they use fentanyl.
Got it.
And that's basically the basis of addiction.
Okay.
Your brain remembers that really powerful reward.
Yeah.
And the more you use the drug,
Yeah.
the less sensitive those receptors become.
Yeah.
So you need more and more.
More and more to get that same feeling.
To get the same effect, exactly.
Got it. Okay. So I think we all kind of know and we've heard a lot about how dangerous fentanyl is.
Yeah.
But why is it so much more dangerous than other opioids?
So the reason fentanyl is so dangerous is because it's so potent.
Yeah.
It's like 100 times stronger than morphine
100 times.
and 50 times stronger than heroin.
50 times than heroin. That's a lot.
And there's even some sources that say that.
Yeah.
Certain relatives of fentanyl are 400 times stronger than morphine.
400?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So what makes it so much more potent?
Well, there's a couple things. One is its ability to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Okay. The blood-brain barrier.
Yeah, that's a barrier that protects your brain
Yeah.
by limiting what can pass through. But really small molecules.
Mm.
And fat-soluble molecules
Yeah.
can pass through fairly easily. So morphine and heroin are lipid-soluble, which means they're fat-soluble. But they also have parts of them that are attracted to water.
Okay.
So that kind of slows them down,
Slows them down.
getting into the brain.
Hmm.
Whereas fentanyl is very nonpolar.
Yeah.
And highly fat-soluble. So it penetrates that blood-brain barrier very easily
Okay.
and very rapidly.
So it gets in there fast.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I think we've all heard that the lethal dose is super, super small.
It's tiny. It's minuscule.
Can you put that in perspective for us?
So the lethal dose of fentanyl is about 2 milligrams.
2 milligrams. Okay.
And to help you visualize that,
Yeah.
if you had it in powder form,
Yeah.
it's about the size of 2 grains of salt.
2 grains of salt.
Yeah.
And that's enough to kill someone.
That's enough to kill someone.
That's insane.
Yeah, and because it takes such a tiny amount to be fatal,
Yeah.
it makes it really hard to measure precisely,
Right.
especially in an illegal setting where the purity and concentration is inconsistent and unpredictable. The risk of accidental overdose is incredibly high.
2 grains of salt.
2 grains of salt.
That's crazy.
It's very dangerous.
And I know we talked about earlier how it can suppress breathing.
Yeah.
Can you kind of go into a little more detail about that?
Yeah, so we talked about how fentanyl binds
Yeah.
to those opioid receptors,
Yeah.
and especially the ones in the brainstem, which are vital for regulating your drive to breathe.
Okay.
So when those receptors are saturated with fentanyl,
Yeah.
your brain becomes less sensitive
Less sensitive. Okay.
to rising carbon dioxide levels.
So it doesn't know
Yeah, your body's not getting the signal
to breathe.
to breathe.
Oh, wow.
And that leads to slowed breathing or even complete respiratory arrest and ultimately death because you're not getting enough oxygen.
And this can happen quickly?
It can happen very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are there other side effects aside from the breathing issues?
There are, yeah. So fentanyl can cause dizziness, chills, vomiting, fainting, difficulty urinating, and then that severe constipation.
Right, from the receptors in the gut.
Yeah, the receptors in the gut.
Okay. Well, thankfully, there's naloxone
Yeah.
or Narcan
Right.
that can help reverse an overdose.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So naloxone is what we call an opioid antagonist.
Opioid antagonist.
Yeah.
Okay.
It binds to those same opioid receptors
Right.
that fentanyl binds to, but it doesn't activate them.
Okay.
It blocks them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So if it's given quickly enough, after an overdose, it can actually displace the fentanyl,
Kick it out.
kick it off those receptors,
Phew.
and reverse that respiratory depression
Okay.
and other life-threatening effects.
So it can save a life.
Yeah, it gives the person a chance to breathe again.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but the effects are temporary.
Okay.
And because fentanyl is so strong
Yeah.
and long-lasting,
Mm.
sometimes you need multiple doses
Multiple doses of naloxone.
of naloxone. Yeah.
Got it. And it sounds like this problem just keeps evolving.
Yeah, it does.
Like, there's these new, even stronger forms of fentanyl.
That's a huge challenge,
That's
keeping
real.
up with the development of these new synthetic opioids, like carfentanil, for instance.
Yeah, carfentanil.
It's 10 million times stronger than morphine.
10 million times.
Yeah. It's so toxic that it's actually been talked about as a possible agent for chemical warfare.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Okay. So let's kind of shift gears and talk about the fentanyl crisis itself.
Okay.
I mean, we hear all the time about these disturbing statistics about overdose deaths.
Yeah, the numbers are really staggering.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
This is like one of the worst drug crises in U.S. history.
Yeah.
We're talking about like 70,000 opioid-related overdose deaths.
70,000 a year?
Yeah, every year.
That's a lot of people.
In the United States.
Yeah.
That's a huge number.
Wow.
And to put that in perspective, back in the early 2000s,
Yeah.
oxycodone.
Or OxyContin.
Yeah, OxyContin was a huge driver of the opioid epidemic.
Right.
But around 2013, fentanyl kind of surpassed oxycodone and heroin
Right.
as the primary drug involved in these overdose deaths.
So it took over
Yeah, it took over.
around 2013.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The increase has been really dramatic.
Yeah.
One of the sources actually pointed out that in 2022,
Yeah.
fentanyl deaths in the U.S. actually exceeded the total number of U.S. military deaths since the 1960s.
Since the 1960s.
Yeah.
So including Vietnam.
Including Vietnam.
Wow.
Yeah. All those conflicts put together.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a huge number.
So what are some of the things that have contributed to this?
It's really a combination of factors
Okay.
that have kind of unfortunately converged.
Okay.
So you've got the pharmaceutical companies
Yeah.
and their aggressive marketing
Oh,
of opioid painkillers.
painkillers. Yeah. Okay.
Back in the 90s and the 2000s, they were overprescribing those.
Yeah.
And that led to a lot of people becoming dependent on opioids.
Right. And then as those prescriptions went down.
Yeah. And then as regulations tightened, people who were struggling with opioid use disorder turned to the black market.
Turned to the black market.
And that's where the illicitly manufactured fentanyl,
Okay.
coming from China, Mexico, and India, became a cheaper and more readily available alternative.
Alternative to like heroin and things like that?
Yeah, heroin and prescription opioids.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's not always people who are seeking out fentanyl
Right.
that are actually getting it.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So a lot of times these days,
Yeah.
illicit fentanyl is disguised in these counterfeit pills that are made to look like legitimate medications, like Xanax, Adderall, or OxyContin.
So someone thinks they're getting a Xanax.
Right, and they had to pick in a fatal dose of fentanyl.
Wow.
We actually heard about this case of this college student named Jack O'Kelly,
Jack O'Kelly.
who died after taking a pill that he thought was a Xanax or oxycodone. And his parents actually said he wasn't seeking out fentanyl.
Oh.
It was just accidental poisoning.
Wow, that's so sad.
It's very sad. So that's a really important thing to understand.
Yeah.
It's a hidden danger in the drug supply. A lot of people who are overdosing on fentanyl
Yeah.
are not what we might think of as like
Yeah.
a traditional drug user.
So where is it all coming from?
So the main producers of this illicit fentanyl
Yeah.
entering the United States are drug cartels based in Mexico.
Okay.
And they get those precursor chemicals, mostly from China.
China. Okay.
Yeah.
And so then they make it in Mexico.
They make it in clandestine labs in Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and then they smuggle it into the U.S.
And they're smuggling it in.
Yeah.
Mostly through
Mostly through legal ports of entry.
legal ports of entry.
Yeah.
Wow.
A lot of times concealed in passenger vehicles.
And passenger vehicles?
Yeah.
Wow.
And what's really crazy is that 2/3
2/3. Okay.
of the people who are arrested for fentanyl smuggling are American citizens.
Are American citizens.
Yeah.
Wow.
They're recruited by the cartels
And paid.
and paid
Yeah.
to bring it across.
To bring it across. Yeah.
Wow.
Including like high school and middle school students.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
It's really scary.
Yeah. So what are we doing to try to stop this?
So law enforcement agencies,
Yeah.
like the DEA,
Okay.
are trying to disrupt the flow of fentanyl
Okay.
by going after the cartels and the precursor chemical suppliers.
So they're trying to hit it at all angles.
Yeah, they're trying to hit it from all sides.
Oh.
There's also been a lot of political discussion about increasing resources for border security.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the bipartisan border bill that failed in the Senate recently would have given a lot of funding for more Border Patrol agents and better technology for detection. But as the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection said, they desperately need more resources to really address the scale of the problem.
Yeah. This is a massive problem.
It's huge.
And there's so many different angles to it.
It's very complex, yeah. So we've heard a lot about China.
Yeah.
And this connection to the Opium Wars. Some people in Congress are even saying that. The influx of Chinese fentanyl is almost like an asymmetric war.
Right.
What's the thinking behind that?
So the argument is that this massive influx of fentanyl coming from China
Yeah.
is basically a form of asymmetric warfare.
Okay.
And they point to the DEA's assessment that like 90%
90%.
of the fentanyl coming into the U.S. can be traced back to Chinese companies.
To Chinese companies?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they also say that these companies are operating legally within China
So they're not doing anything wrong?
in the eyes of the Chinese government.
In the eyes of the Chinese government?
Yeah, and they may even be getting subsidies and backing from the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the idea is that
Yeah.
China is intentionally facilitating this flow of precursor chemicals
Yeah.
to those Mexican cartels
Who then make the fentanyl?
who then manufacture the
And
fentanyl.
put it across the border.
Right. Yeah. And the goal would be to exploit America's
Yeah.
vulnerability to drug action and weaken the nation.
Wow. Okay. So what is China saying about all this?
Well, China denies all of that.
Okay.
They say that the fentanyl crisis is basically a domestic issue for the U.S.
They're saying it's our fault.
They're saying it's our fault. Yeah.
Okay.
They
That's
blamed
interesting.
Big Pharma.
Big Pharma, yeah.
They blame weak drug laws in the U.S. and what they call a culture that glorifies drug use.
Okay, so they're saying it's a cultural problem in America.
Exactly.
Wow.
So it's a very different perspective.
Very different.
That makes it difficult to collaborate on a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the Opium Wars.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting historical parallel.
Yeah.
Can you kind of explain what happened with the Opium Wars?
Yeah, so the Opium Wars were in the mid-1800s.
Okay, 1800s.
And it's a good example of how drugs can get tied up with geopolitics.
Okay.
So at the time, Great Britain and the United States had a big demand for Chinese tea and silk.
Oh, okay. Yeah, tea and silk from China.
Yeah. But Britain was facing a shortage of silver to pay for those goods.
Right.
So they turned to their colony in India and started producing huge amounts of opium.
Opium?
Yeah.
Which is very addictive.
Very addictive. And then they traded that to China for the tea and silk.
Oh, wow. So they were trading opium.
Yeah, they were trading opium for tea and silk.
For tea and silk.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they were essentially getting the Chinese population addicted.
That's what happened to opium.
By the mid-1800s,
Yeah.
millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium.
Oh, wow.
And that led to major social and economic problems.